Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and with harvest wrapping up in Western Canada, one of the things that we always like to do is have a discussion about some of the challenges of the past year to figure out what can help growers going into next year and beyond. And this year, two issues with diseases cropped up in the canola crop that are going to need some management going forward, and that's Blackleg and Verticillium. To help us learn about the impact over this year and, more importantly, what we can do about it, we've got Shawna Hogg, a Pioneer sales rep based in central Alberta, and Tom Ernst, a senior research associate with Pioneer, also based in Alberta. Shawna, Tom, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So this is one where, as harvest wraps up for you folks in Western Canada and in central Alberta, I think it's a really great time of year to have the discussion. How did the year go? What were some of the challenges, particularly when we talk about diseases in canola that, as growers, what can you do to better manage that and obviously, be able to produce a better crop next year? So, Shawna, let's start with you in terms of, I've kind of got four diseases I'd love to chat about today. The first one being the one that I think impacted you and your growers the most, blackleg. Can you talk about what the season for blackleg was?
Yeah, this year definitely was the worst number of incidences that I've seen in the last 5-6 years in this area. This area we always tend to have some and find some in a lot of fields, but this year the severity was much higher than what it normally would be. We had a very cold, dry, slow early emergence going into the middle of June. And then we had a number of big rain events, micro hail events in that kind of first or second week of June, when the canola would have been at that 2 to 5 leaf stage. And then that just allowed the blackleg to enter the plant through those little lesions, those little bruises on the plant from the rain and the hail. And it entered in kind of a non-traditional way, and it really affected the plants or infected the plants at that stage.
Now, it's not something that's necessarily new for you to be battling blackleg. This is something that you guys have had, lots of times before. I guess I'm curious, in a bad year like this, what's on the top of mind of growers? How do growers manage it, and what are they thinking needs to happen going into 2025?
Yeah, I think for blackleg, the main management is rotation. So sticking with that 3+ year rotation is a very sound management practice for blackleg. Again, this year was very unique on how it entered the plant and in that early June time frame. I think on a normal year, we wouldn't have had the level of severity that we did this year. But I think, if growers stick to that rotation and are growing, rotating their hybrids and their Clubroot or their blackleg resistance with their hybrids, I think that is something that we need to continue to talk about and look at.
So then, Tom, that's kind of the story in central Alberta. What did you hear, from kind of your team across Western Canada in terms of blackleg, and how top of mind is it from a research standpoint?
Yeah, so I guess when I'm looking at our trialing across Western Canada, and from what I've been hearing, Alberta did get hit pretty hard. I guess in public testing across Western Canada, some of the highest infected fields were from Alberta. In terms of field visits in kind of more north central Alberta around the Edmonton region, I had a lot more calls out for blackleg as well this year. And it's definitely been a bit of a focus in our area for sure. And like for all those reasons that Shawna pointed out, we had similar situation up in the Edmonton region where we had that slow early growth because cool, wet, rainy conditions. And that's kind of the most susceptible phase for the canola plant is, from that cotyledon to four-leaf stage. So we had a lot of rains in that period. We even had some frosts that damaged plants, and like Shawna was saying, some micro hail events, lots and lots of pounding rain. And so, it took off early this year, early infections.
So then I guess the big question is, obviously there's an impact to yield, and that'll be my first question. Just what kind of impact do you usually see with blackleg? But then second to that is, what can be done about it? How does a grower, try to at least reduce the impact when a lot of those things that Shawna talks about in terms of the reasons why it happened are absolutely out of their control?
I guess from a yield loss perspective, on a per plant basis, you can get, anywhere between 20% to 80% yield loss on a single plant. But if you're looking across a whole crop, averages get up to 15-20% in an infected crop. Depends on the incidence and severity, how much is in the field and how bad it is on each plant in that field. And there's really great tools to do yield loss calculations based on those two metrics, how much is there and how bad it is. So encourage people to look that up if they're curious, what the potential yield loss was on their field. The second part of the question again, sorry, Andrew.
No, that's okay. The second part really is when Shawna talks about all of the things that made blackleg, more challenging. That longer start that the canola seed had, the hail events, all of those types of things. A grower's not really able to fix that. So how can they try to reduce the impact, to make sure they don't see that 20% yield loss?
Right. So management going forward after a year like this, like Shawna was saying, crop rotation would have a big effect, so that stubble that's subsisting in the soil will be carrying that pathogen for years forward. And so the longer we can wait to let that pathogen break down on the stubble, the more success you'll have when you go back into canola next time, right? There's some seed applied technology, some seed treatments that have some efficacy on blackleg. Like selecting those could help prevent some of that early establishment of the pathogen, as well as it's used often as a strategy in Australia. And I've heard of, Shawna mentioned some growers that are using foliar applied fungicide along with their first herbicide application in really, really tough situations. That could be another tool that could be deployed. And so all these things together, as well as selecting good hybrids with strong blackleg resistance, are all good management tools going forward when you go back into a situation where you had a lot of blackleg in the past.
The other disease, Shawna, that we talked about as being one of those ones that maybe not necessarily came out of nowhere, but definitely is a new one for growers that maybe had more prevalence this year compared to past. Verticillium. Can you talk a little bit about verticillium in your area of central Alberta?
Yeah, so verticillium is a very new disease to Alberta, Western Canada. In general, it's a new canola disease. I first saw it in a field in 2021, so 3 years ago. Not really knowing what it was, so trying to identify it with the Canola Council agronomist, the Pioneer agronomist. And then last year I had a field that a grower phoned and said, hey, this hybrid is really early, which it shouldn't have been. So I knew something was going on. Typically with Blackleg, Sclerotinia, Clubroot, that's where you get that premature death. So wanted to go out to the field just to see, okay, what's going on here? Why is it dying earlier than what it should have? And then started picking plants and cutting them and finding verticillium there. So this year, probably 50% of the fields that I cut had some degree of verticillium in it. Most of those fields had blackleg as well. So I think this year why I was seeing more verticillium is that it initially had a blackleg infection that kind of weakened the plant. And maybe allowed the verticillium to come in a little bit earlier than what maybe it normally would.
Then, Tom, it's new, and this is kind of putting you on the spot where whenever there are new diseases, we all look to research teams for all of the answers. And so, Tom, I guess from your perspective, what do we know about verticillium? What's its impact across Western Canada? And honestly, because it is so new, can you walk through a little bit in terms of just how does it infect a plant in the first place?
Sure, yeah. So I guess the causal agent is a fungal pathogen called Verticillium longisporum. And so the way it works is it subsists in, again, like blackleg in stubble, but also in the soil as microsclerotia, these tiny sclerotia bodies that will produce, will infect roots early season. It will grow up from the root as opposed to blackleg, which goes leaves down. It grows roots up and plugs up the vascular system as it moves internal to the plant, siphoning off some of the nutrients and energy that the plant's taking up, nutrients and moisture that the plant's taking up during its growth. And so that causes some of the typical symptoms that we see later on. We see this striping, sometimes unilateral striping, so half the plant dead, some premature ripening in the canopy on one side versus the other, or it can be whole plant verticillium, where like most of the vascular tissue is plugged up by the pathogen. And so that premature ripening, you can expect yield loss and quality changes as well, similar to any pathogen that causes those kind of symptoms.
This is obviously, within the last couple of years has popped up in central Alberta. Where else do we find it in Western Canada?
Yeah, so it's predominantly found in Manitoba. That's where it was first found. And that's where the incidence is highest on a field by field basis. So that's where the majority of the research is currently happening. Let's see, we've been doing some field trialing since about 2017 in terms of trying to screen, seed products, hybrids for tolerance against the pathogen. It's quite environmentally dependent, and it's a tricky one to work with. And what the exact environmental conditions that are conducive for the pathogen are is still a little bit unknown. And I guess we're not totally sure exactly what the environmental conditions are that are most favorable for it, but where I've seen years with the highest level of incidence and severity, like this year in Manitoba, was where we had a good availability of early season moisture. And I think that's important for that root infection to occur. Where you really see the late season symptoms ramp up is where it gets warm and dry. And so maybe this year's a bad example because in Manitoba, it did get quite cool and wet late season. So I'm not sure exactly how it panned out, but there was quite a bit of mid-year symptoms that were causing premature ripening. They're definitely going to have a yield effect in Manitoba. So.
Do we know what that yield effect can be? Obviously, it's going to vary on a lot of situations, but do we kind of have a ballpark of what could happen in a tougher year?
Yeah, so yield loss modeling is still underway. I know there's a group at the University of Alberta that's developing yield loss model for verticillium right now. I don't have an exact number for it off the top of my head, and it's still kind of being worked on and being developed, but definitely yield loss, the higher your incidence and severity gets, right?
Then, Shawna, in terms of what to do about it, I guess if this is a year where it was more impactful than past years, in some of the conversations that you're having with growers in your area, is there a change in management strategy coming for trying to deal with verticillium, or is it a case of it's kind of one and hope we don't see too many, or just where's the mindset at with a new disease like this?
Yeah, I think there are companies like Pioneer. On all our hybrids, we do have verticillium ratings on the different hybrids, and there is, I'm not sure that we call it resistance, but there is different levels of tolerance on there. So looking at hybrids from that perspective, and yeah, I think we can assume that longer rotation is better, perhaps. So I think making sure that we're sticking to that 3+ year rotation on canola.
Could I add to Shawna's?
I was throwing to you, Tom, because I am very curious. Like it sounds a lot like the same things that are gonna help prevent the impact of blackleg may, at least while we learn more, help us on verticillium too.
Yeah. So and like Sean was saying earlier, it's fairly new in Western Canada. So a big component of management right now is still the prevention of spread. And so uh, if you think about the pathogen, it subsists in the soil. And so a lot of the same management strategies that work for preventing the spread of clubroot may also apply for verticillium and could be useful to practice. So, preventing the movement of soil between fields as much as possible. If you have seen verticillium in an area, maybe work towards it instead of away from that field. So you're not dragging it out of that field to other areas of your farm. In terms of other management strategies, we do characterize our hybrids for a certain level of tolerance, and we're looking for kind of a stable package that can be deployed under some verticillium pressure and still be able to perform. And so we are assigning some numbers on a rating scale within our product guide, and that could help people make a informed hybrid selection. If you're looking at verticillium as the main concern in your area. And in terms of stability and what we're aiming for in the seed development group, we're looking to develop hybrids that have good verticillium tolerance, but also paired with a good blackleg tolerance, or blackleg resistance, I should say. The reason for that being that those pathogens often come and synergize, or happen at the same time. They synergize quite well with each other, and they tend to increase the pressure that each other and the severity of one another, I guess.
So then I guess the next part of that is we talk a lot about blackleg and verticillium here, but there's two other diseases that I think obviously can have a pretty enormous impact depending on the year. Maybe not this year, but in other years, being Sclerotinia and Clubroot. So just in the last few minutes, I wanted to touch on both of those, because they are more well known, at least. In terms of, maybe quickly on the Sclerotinia side first, Shawna. What do you see from growers around Alberta in terms of its impact on a year like this?
Yeah, I think Sclerotinia would be the main canola disease that growers think about and try to manage with a fungicide application. This year, we did not have the conditions that were conducive for an infection to take hold. So kind of during that flowering window, we did get quite dry. So the canopy didn't have the moisture level or the humidity in the canopy that we do on other years that would cause a Sclerotinia infection. Pioneer has Sclerotinia resistant hybrids. And they would be my number one selling hybrids in this geography. So growers are well aware and know that Sclerotinia is a problem. So growing a Sclerotinia resistant hybrid just helps them manage that. So whether they spray or not, it does reduce the level of infection. And on a really wet year in July, even if you're growing a Sclerotinia resistant hybrid, a lot of guys do choose to spray as well, just to increase that level of control. This year, like I said, we were so dry we didn't see any disease whatsoever.
Well, when you do talk about that, that is actually one of those subjects that earlier in the summer we had both Doug and Taylor on to talk specifically about Sclerotinia and some of the tools that you can do to try to, again, reduce the impact. But Tom, kind of quickly from you, in terms of what you see from the research side, what are some of those things that kind of match along the lines of what Sean is saying in terms of picking the right hybrids, as well as, maybe that, kind of foliar application later in the season too?
Yeah, I think Shawna hit the nail on the head. Like a lot of the same things apply to what we're working on as tools in the research group. It's a very year over year pathogen that you have to make a decision based off the environmental conditions of that year, right? So like Shawna was saying, this year just wasn't really conducive for the pathogen. And so a lot of growers made the choice, there wasn't requirement of fuller application of fungicide, but in a more wet year through the July window, using those fungicides as a tool to manage it can be quite effective. And then what we're working on the seed side of the research group is to develop Sclerotinia tolerant and resistant hybrids that can be deployed and have reduce the incidence and severity of the pathogen from a genetic using the genetics of the plant itself. So, and that paired with the fungicide treatment is extremely powerful management tools to deploy when you're faced with Sclerotinia.
Tom, on the Clubroot side of things, give me an idea from kind of you and that seed development team in terms of where Clubroot ranks, in terms of what you're doing when you're working on those new hybrids.
Provincial surveys are still coming out for this year. I know Alberta is expecting, a steady increase in incidence still across the province. They are finding new cases, but from my perspective, I've been called out a lot less to look at, fields that have, clubroot being found and stuff like that this year. Environmentally wise, it could be from a number of different reasons, like we did have that really cool early spring. And so maybe it kind of slowed and delayed the establishment of the pathogen. So clubroot doesn't really become too active until the soil temperatures warm up quite a bit. And we even had snow in northern Alberta or north central Alberta, we have a lot of the clubroot. We even had snow into late May kind of thing. So some sleet and stuff like that, right? I guess from what we're working on from a clubroot perspective in the seed development side of the research group is we're looking at developing clubroot resistant packages in our hybrids and characterizing them really well so we know, that we're covering the diversity of the pathogen out there as we know it in terms of what we're resistant against. Clubroot is so diverse and it changes constantly. And so even in a year like this, where there's not much being found in the field, we're still working on, trying to figure out how diverse and how virulent clubroot is and trying to characterize our hybrids against that so that we're ready for a year when clubroot is an issue and we have, hybrids that will work.
Well, it certainly is great to have both your perspectives, in terms of what those diseases look like in a year like this, but obviously more importantly, what we can do about it and hopefully be able to improve going into, future growing seasons. So Shawna, Tom, thanks very much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that does it for this episode. Don't forget, whether you listen to us on a podcast app or watch the episodes on Corteva Canada's YouTube channel, by subscribing, you'll be among the first to know when a new episode drops. So make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can always follow Pioneer Seeds on X at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or find me at Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.